Welcome back to Can I Has Buff, the Warframe series that takes a look at older or weaker weapons in the game that need a buff or rework to fit with the current game. In this special episode, I will be going over the entire Gorgon series of weapons, heavy machine guns manufactured by the Grineer that look cool, sound okay, and are okay in terms of stats. The standard Gorgon rifle is one of the oldest weapons in Warframe, released in the first closed beta launch of the game, and received patches and tweaks along its lifespan, such as getting a slight boost in crits during Damage 2.0. When compared to a standard Bratton assault rifle, you can see why people generally don't care for this weapon, as while you do get a boost in damage, the accuracy loss, reload speed, and reliance on impact can make it fairly unruly to wield versus most enemies. For new players, the Gorgon is actually worth building once you pick up the blueprint from killed heavy gunner enemies, as it can replace your Bratton or MK1 Bratton as your higher damage rifle until you can get an upgrade. Because the weapons were all made by Grineer, they focus on battling the corpus. The Gorgon is impact heavy, with 75% of the damage being impact, which while good versus shields has a 25% reduction to corpus and Grineer flesh types, the weapon can suffer badly versus heavy armor, as impact damage will be reduced by the armor first, then slashed by 25% when reaching their health. While it can be built for corrosive in status to strip armor, which ends up being better than raw damage on higher levels, the weapon is generally poor when it comes to stripping armor. It also has a good 10% crit chance, but a rather stale 1.5 times multiplier, meaning crits you get will only be marginally improved over normal shots and should not be modded for. The Gorgon has undergone 2 sound changes in its lifetime, from a very heavy metal hammer sound on its original release to a softer, more mechanical sound later on, to the sound we hear today. People objected to the sound changes DE made to the weapon, but unlike the Heck, which received a redux sound based on its original, the Gorgon still lacks its powerful mechanical sound it used to have. In fact, the weapon sound seemingly changes in the hands of enemies or other players, receiving a more bassy sound effect than when the player uses it themselves. I used to fear heavy gunners with their powerful machine guns due to the mechanical whirring and rattling of the gears or ammo belts, but now they are sadly not as powerful to hear or use. Except for the sound, the Gorgon looks and feels very good to use in my opinion, and with a few tweaks it could become as powerful as it looks. As powerful and menacing as the Gorgon appears, its stats do not reflect its power as it should be, so here are a few changes to buff the Gorgon. 25 base damage feels a bit low for a gun like the Gorgon, and I feel a damage boost mechanic should be added to the weapon as it spools up. When starting to fire up until the weapon is fully spooled, weapon damage increases from 25 on the first bullets to 34 when fully spooled, which also gradually increases the puncture damage over impact to allow a fully spooled Gorgon to be 60% impact, 30% puncture, and 10% slash. In addition to this increased spool up, the Gorgon's magazine will now be 130 at base, allowing more time for the weapon to continue to spool up and give the advantages I mentioned. This is all I suggest for the Gorgon, as it will push the weapon up a bit further where it deserves to be, while also making it worth using for a while longer on the star chart. Originally a product of the Tethras Doom event, the Wraith variant of the Gorgon entered the battlefield on update 12.4 on March 5, 2014. It was later awarded during the Infested Nightmares bonus weekend Survive or Die alert, and later released in blueprints and parts from defeating the Corpus Razorback when it arrives. Sporting a higher total damage, much higher status chance, higher fire rate, faster reload speed, and a faster spool up time, the Gorgon Wraith is, in my opinion, the superior Gorgon versus Grineer. While slash and puncture is now lowered to bring the impact up to 85% of the total damage, the other stat increases, status especially, brings the weapon into much higher level content compared to the normal Gorgon. While better in pretty much every way to the normal Gorgon, it still has some issues. Status chance is an incredibly useful stat when fighting Grineer with armor, and it allows the Gorgon Wraith to be the only one in the series to reliably use corrosive damage to strip armor, or even utilize gas for Infested and Corpus. While on its own, the damage on modded is actually worse against Corpus crewmen and Grineer clones due to the impact damage, the higher damage from elementals more than covers for this, and the status helps push this even further. Unlike some other Wraith weaponry, the Gorgon Wraith has the exact same sound as the normal, so generally speaking the weapon feels very much the same to use, except for the fact that it much more reliably kills enemies, and thus makes it more fun to use. Similar to my suggestion to the normal Gorgon, I feel stat boost to the windup would add an interesting, if not mild, mechanic that would allow the weapon to feel much more powerful. Like the Gorgon buff that I mentioned, damage will increase as it spools up to its maximum fire rate, except with the Wraith I suggest slightly different buffs. Damage will go up from 27 total damage at base to 36 at full spool, but impact will gradually lower in favor of more slash damage instead of puncture, giving the weapon 50% impact, 30% slash, and 20% puncture at full spool. A larger magazine size of 140 combined with its high status chance will allow the weapon to shred Grineer enemies and Corpus alike, while also being deadly versus the infested as well. Being a Prisma weapon, the weapon currently can be sold by KhorCS when he has it in stock, but was originally sold during the month of January in 2015. Bathed in a glowing blue texture that can shine brightly with some colors, the Prisma is the best visually appealing Gorgon in the series, however its looks are only as deep as the Prisma used to make it. The Prisma Gorgon is a direct upgrade to the normal Gorgon, boosting positive stats across the board in terms of fire rate, magazine size, more max ammo, faster reload, and a faster spool up time. The best changes, however, comes in the form of a better crit chance and crit damage, making the Prisma model more crit focused than the others. It has the same damage as the normal Gorgon, however, with 75% of it being impact, as well as the same low status chance of only 5%, making the Prisma version still fairly poor versus Grineer armor. The increased stats can potentially make it better against unarmored Grineer, Corpus, and infested, however. The Prisma Gorgon sports a different sound compared to the other variants, which has a reverb-heavy ping to it, as well as stylized echoes to match the Prisma style of weapon sounds. For me, however, the sound is quite jarring for something that is supposed to be a heavy machine gun, and despite the sound matching the Prisma design, I find the sound very distracting to use, which makes the weapon feel weak to wield. Sticking to the trend I have been setting for the spool up style buff, the same will be true for the Prisma but with stats to match its strengths. When fully spooled, the damage of the Prisma Gorgon will go up from 25 at base to 35, one more than the normal Gorgon, but one less than the Wraith. Unlike the previous models, however, the impact damage will actually increase in this variant, bringing the weapon to 100% impact damage on full spool, with a 200 round magazine to match its new sleek stats and increased stats over the normal version. In addition, the Prisma Gorgon will gradually increase in accuracy as it spools up, similar to the Tenora rifle, gaining a base accuracy of 35 when fully spooled up to help it take advantage of its increased critical stats. While the status will remain at 5%, the change over to impact will allow pure corrosive status builds to be more effective if modded this way, as only 2 different procs could potentially occur on the weapon. This change would make the Prisma much more deadly versus unarmored enemies, but also give it a fair chance versus armor if built correctly. Now that you've heard my buff suggestions for the weapons, I wanted to talk briefly about Riven Mods and how they can affect the Gorgons. Because the weapons have a 4 out of 5 disposition, the stats on Riven Mods could potentially be quite high, which is excellent news for the Gorgon Wraith and the Prisma Gorgon. For the Gorgon Wraith, Riven Mods can be favored with multi-shot and status chance, boosting the armor stripping power by an incredible amount, and allow the weapon to go fairly far into high levels. If favoring the Prisma version, damage and crits could be rolled to allow the weapon to melt unarmored enemies very quickly, or even just raw damage to allow the crits to be further boosted. None of the changes I suggested in this video would make the Gorgon weapons overpowered or anything, so I feel the disposition would most likely remain the same as a result. The Gorgon series of weapons are in my top 10 weapons in the game, with the Gorgon Wraith being in my top 5. Just like my love for the Kraken pistol, I can't deny their weaknesses, but just like I did a Can I Has buff for the Kraken as my first episode in this series, I can give more reasonable buff suggestions based on my heavy use that DE could use to more accurately buff the weapons in the future. I don't personally think the Gorgon weapons should be great weapons, only good, but I hope that someday perhaps the weapons can get buffs similar to the suggestions I made to make them more viable.